Okay, welcome and thank you all so much for joining us this evening for the Spotlight on Cannabis, what every parent and caregiver needs to know. My name is Catherine, and I am your community engagement liaison with Adopt for Life, a not-for-profit charitable organization that provides peer support, community, education, advocacy, and awareness to adoption, permanency, kinship, and customary care communities across Ontario and even beyond. We are so very honored here to have both Chantal and Steve from Drug Free Kids Canada, who will be sharing evidence-based and youth-informed information that aims to empower us to initiate an informed and non-judgmental dialogue with our children and youth that we are caring for. Before I kind of go into how we'll be using this platform and introducing our guests, I do want to take pause and acknowledge the lands that we are situated on today, understanding that we are joining in from all different parts of this beautiful province. I personally reside in the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and the Mississauga of the Credits people within Treaty 19, now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We do this really to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations, and as a first step towards improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures, to recognize and acknowledge the historic and ongoing devastating effects of colonialism and racism in the name of assimilation across Canada, and to consider how we each can, in our own way, action forward in a spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. Now I will be formally introducing our guests for this evening. Chantal is the Executive Director of Drug Free Kids Canada. It is a national organization a national registered charity whose mission is to reduce the prevalence of problematic substance use by our youth. Her work engages parents and youth to have ongoing non-judgmental dialogue about substance use and to promote healthy decision-making and reduce cannabis and other substance-related harms. Chantal holds a bachelor degree in communications from the University of Ottawa and a Master's of Business Administration, or an MBA, from Laurentian University. Next, I'd also like to introduce you all to Steve. He is the program developer for Drug Free Kids Canada. He graduated from Trent University with a Bachelor's of Education and has been supporting youth through facilitating mental health and addiction programs since 2015. He is passionate and energetic public speaker who enjoys helping exchange knowledge between credited research and audiences around Canada. So welcome and thank you both so much for joining us. We want this to be an engaging and interactive webinar, so please feel free to use this chat feature if there are any tech-related issues. I will do my absolute best on my end to help support you through it. If you want to share, have any comments, or engage with the content in any way, this is what you can use the chat feature for. If you do have specific questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A feature. And you'll have an option of actually being able to ask anonymously if you prefer. So during the slides, as Chantal and Steve talk, please feel free to populate all your questions in the Q&A, and there will be specific time at the end of the webinar to answer as many as possible. There is also an option for you to enable closed captioning. You just need to press the specific button on your screen. For those who are wondering, this video will be recorded and you will receive a copy of it in the coming days. So with that being said, I tried to be as succinct as possible. I'm going to be turning off my camera and I'm going to be handing it over to our wonderful guests. Thanks so much.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Catherine. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Steve Keller. I'm the project developer for Drug Free Kids Canada. And over the next half an hour or so, you're going to be hearing a lot of my voice, after which point I will be deferring over to our executive director, Chantal, to do the second half of this presentation, after which point we'll be able to take some Q&A. So I'm going to take a moment to get my screen set up here to share. Terrific. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what we're covering tonight. Now, the presentation that we have is titled Substance Use Prevention with a Spotlight on Cannabis. We are going to touch a little bit on a couple of other substances in the presentation, just because there is that idea of polysubstance use that we know is becoming an increasing point of discussion. Furthermore, Drug Free Kids Expanse in Knowledge does cover substances beyond cannabis, but the central highlight of this presentation will be on the topic of cannabis. With that in mind, before I get into exactly what we're going to cover, I want to talk a little bit about where our research has come from. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the many resources that we've looked into in the development of this presentation. They include various resources from the Government of Canada, particularly Health and Stats Canada, as well as the Department of Justice. We also have the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol and Drugs Survey, also known as the CSTADS, Canadian Alcohol and Drug Survey, the Canadian Post-Secondary Alcohol and Drug Survey, as well as Canadian Tobacco and Nicotine Survey, and the Canadian Cannabis Survey. Now, you're going to see a lot of these abbreviations during the presentation: CSTADS, CPADS, CADS, CCS. I don't want you to worry too much about getting hung up in those abbreviations and who exactly said what was what about the numbers. What's more important to consider tonight is the trends in the data, or are the actual sort of behaviors that we saw that came up across multiple different surveys that sort of showed a pattern reflective of behavior with substance use. And of course, finally, the last set of resources, which you can actually find on our website, drugfreekidscanada.org, come from the Cannabis Talk Kit, the youth and alcohol and youth and vaping missives that are offered on our website. Now, during this presentation, I am going to be offering a series of interactive polls, and I'm going to pull the first one up here. You can answer this one live while I'm reading it. True or false, it is best to wait to speak with youth about substance use until they turn 19. Now, in past projects that I've worked on, I've heard parents and sometimes professionals say that they don't know if they should be having the conversation with youth prior to the legal age because they don't want to expose them to substance use. Well, what does our audience think tonight? I see by and large about 2/3 of the audience has responded at this point. I'll give you guys about 5 more seconds. We'll close it up. Close it up in 3, 2, and 1. Poll's now closing. All right. So it looks like we had about 76% participation, and everyone said the answer to this is false. You would indeed be correct. Of the presentations we've done thus far, I haven't had a soul say true, which is good. I often like to joke this is a survey to make sure the panel's working. But the correct answer here is this is false. But why is that? The reason is that the average age that youth try substances is not at 19. It's not that as soon as they're legal, they say, oh, well, it's a great thing I waited. Now I'm going to start. No, we know that the average age that youth try alcohol and tobacco comes in around 13, and the average first time age of cannabis use is age 14. This is why we recommend that conversations about substance use need to begin before the age of initiation. And I've heard parents say before that they don't know if they're the ones to have that conversation. They may say, well, my kid's not listening, so why am I going to have this discussion? Why am I even going to bring this up? Well, a couple of years ago, DFK actually conducted a tracking study of youth and parents across Canada. And the research that they actually found saw that about 63% of teens reported that their information about drugs, the first source they went to actually was their parents, and it was school. So those conversations, not only do we encourage you to have them at young ages, but we encourage you to have them, period. Even if you think they may not get through, we know statistically that they are. Now, what can you talk about when you have those conversations? Now, there's a question that comes up very fair on both sides, is to ask, why might a youth use substances? Why may a youth not use substances? Most of us tend to focus on the column here on the left. And when we look at the reasons that youth may choose to use substances, these include things like curiosity, pleasure, the social factors like fitting in or peer pressure or peer selection, the influence of media, the things that they see online or on social media, the idea of coping or stress relief. And in the case of cannabis, there's that unique idea of the potential for perceived medical benefits. And we'll talk a little bit about medical cannabis a little later. Couple things to note about this list is that number one, everyone's reason for using a substance is different. And it's important to point this out to a youth that they don't base their decisions on other people's perceptions and other people's experiences, especially with a substance like cannabis, whose effects can be so varied. You may have a youth hear from someone else that they use cannabis because, quote, it helps them deal with stress, even though research has shown increasingly that the presence of THC actually increases symptomology of anxiety or stress-related disorders. A youth may choose to use cannabis, and if they have a family history of, say, psychosis or schizophrenia, the use of THC at an adolescent age may increase actually the risk of them having a medical episode with these psychological conditions, particularly earlier on in life. So we want to make sure youth aren't basing their decisions on other people's opinions, but on their own values. And if we're going to ask why youth may choose to use substances, an equally fair question is to ask youth, well, why don't they use? Some of the reasons we see here include fear of consequences, negative experiences. Perhaps they've used and had a bad trip or a bad evening. Maybe they've gotten sick. Maybe they've seen other people have negative experiences. There's the stigma, the perceived negative reaction of individuals or society or culture to a person's decision or values or actions, for instance, using cannabis. We see values and opinions about substance use. Some people just simply aren't interested in using. And finally, some youth may choose not to use because of the effects on the body and the mind. The interesting thing about this topic of looking at why someone would use versus why they may not is a lot of these factors, they actually come from the same basis. People say they use cannabis because they like the feeling of being high. So they're trying to change and alter their mental state. Other people say they don't because they don't want to change their mental state. Some people say they use for medical purposes. Some people say they don't for medical purposes. So it's important to understand that every youth's reason for use is different. The reason for continued use can change, and it's important to be respectful of a youth's decision to use, but also remind them that they need to be respectful of a person's decision, including their own, not to use. Question number 2. Age range reports the highest rate of overall substance use. This includes cannabis. This also includes tobacco, alcohol, and vaping. Is it teens, young adults, adults, or seniors age 65 and above? What are we thinking? All right. And I do see a question popped up in the chat panel, and I'm sure we will definitely have time to get to this at the end. Don't worry. I haven't forgotten. All right. So I see we've got about 3/4 of the vote in. I'm going to close it up here in 3 seconds. 3, 2, and 1. Poll is now closing. Looks like we have a bit of a divide here. A little under half saying young adults, a little bit less saying teens, a few people saying adults. Interesting, nobody guesses seniors. The majority of our audience that voted young adults would indeed be correct. Young adults aged 20 to 24 report the highest rate of overall substance use in Canada. This is the case with alcohol, where they're tied with adults over 25. This is the case with cannabis, whereby they report about 24% use in the past 30 days. This is the case with tobacco, and it's also the case with vaping. Now, teens report higher rates of vaping, and significantly, they report higher rates of cannabis use than adults ages 25 and above. So the majority of teens, what we see in this information, it's very important to note, they actually don't report past 30-day use. And in fact, even if you track back to past 12-month use, the majority of teens do not actually report using cannabis in the past 12 months. Now, why is that important? There's a misconception or even a myth, you might say, held among some people that everyone's using cannabis. Since legalization, everybody's using. And we'll touch on that in a moment. But the issue is if you tell a youth and have a conversation with a youth and you frame that conversation around the idea that everyone is using, the risk you actually have is you may actually enable them to consider use because you're actually telling them that more people are using than they are. What becomes more important is to point out the reality that only a minority of youth report past 30-day use. And in a moment, I'm even going to show you what past 12-month use looks like. I also have a note here that vaping among young Canadians aged 20 to 24 has increased over the past couple of years, just as those teens have been aging into that next demographic. Now, I mentioned I was going to show you past year use versus past 30-day use. The research I'm showing you is actually just released over the past 4 weeks. It's from the 2020 and 2021 Canadian Post-Secondary Alcohol and Drug Survey, was released in 2022, as well as the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey, which was just released within the past month. When we look at cannabis use, first of all, we see about 3% of grade 7s report past year use. Still significant. That number increasing to about 15% by grade 9, 26%, or a little over a quarter of grade 10s, and 41% of grade 12s. Alcohol, the numbers are a little bit higher. We see 11% in grade 7, 49% in grade 10, so the number jumps above majority in grade 11. But again, what's worth noting here, especially with cannabis, is that the majority of teens, even at that highest point of use in high school, right at grade 12, the majority of teens still don't report past 12-month use. So again, it helps to remind a young person if they're considering use, instead of assuming that everyone is using, to remind them that the majority of people actually choose not to use cannabis, and their own decisions need to be based on their own understanding and their own knowledge. And that's where we step in to provide that information. I alluded to this question a moment ago, but what happened after legalization? I'm going to ask you as a group, what do you think has happened since 2018 among cannabis use with teens aged 12 to 17? Have we seen it cut in half? Have we seen it increase slightly? Have we seen it decrease slightly? Have we seen it double? What do we think? Legalization was almost 5 years ago. What impact do we think that's had? Well, I see the majority, slight majority, is saying about an increase slightly. Next highest response I'm seeing is doubled. Some people saying decreased, some people saying cut in half. It looks like we had everyone vote, by the way. Terrific. I do like 100% response. But the most common response we see is that there was a slight increase. In essence, you would be correct. There was a slight increase. Now, did we see a difference in provinces, or did we see a pattern in provinces? Well, the answer is we did see a difference. What I have here are the last 3 Canadian student tobacco, alcohol, and drug surveys. And if you're wondering how many students were sampled in this survey report, the 2016-17 survey, which was the last one taken before legalization, surveyed 55,800 students. The one in 2018-2019 surveyed 63,000 students. And the one that was done just last year and the year before surveyed about 61,000 students. So we have a significant amount of research done across a very large group of young people in Canada. And we don't see a traditional pattern here of any kind. Some provinces, like Ontario, have seen an increase from 15 to 18% in the last couple of years, but by and large, there's not a one-size-fits-all here. While Ontario has reported an increase, Nova Scotia reported a decrease. BC reported an increase in 2018, but then dropped back off after the COVID pandemic. Manitoba reported an increase after legalization, but also after the pandemic. Your maritime or your Atlantic provinces reported a decrease after legalization. So there's not a large change that happened. Overall, we saw a slight increase from about 16.7 in 2017 to 18.1% of teens reporting past year use in 2019. And that number has held fairly consistently over the last 3 years since. So it's at about 18.3%. One thing that has changed is how willing someone is to disclose cannabis use. Sometimes I pull this report up and people go, oh, well, youth don't really want to talk about it. In 2019, about 44% of teens reported they were more likely to disclose cannabis use since legalization occurred. And about 22% said they would have said they use no matter what. 2 years later, those willing to disclose after legalization, that number rose to 50%. So we're seeing a little bit of a lessening of the stigma around cannabis. We're seeing a little bit more willingness on the part of young people to actually say and come forward, yes, I use, which is important because it invites more dialogue. It invites us that opportunity to ask them questions about why they use, what they're considering, what they're thinking about using, how they're using. But one of the things I point out is that you will have youth that say they use cannabis for medical purposes. In 2022, the Canadian Cannabis Survey found that about 10% of teens aged 16 to 19 said they used cannabis for medical purposes, and about 14% of young adults did. But among the young adult demographic, 81% of them were using for medical purposes, but had never actually spoken to their doctor about any of the medical benefits or properties or potentials or risks about cannabis. In other words, they were self-medicating as opposed to prescription. They were self-medicating as opposed to consulting to see if there were alternative options to support their health and wellness. This is important because there are many misconceptions about what cannabis is capable of versus what it may not actually be capable of. And there's still research ongoing into what medical cannabis may or may not be useful for. And we can chat to that a little later if you'd like. Talked about how changes occurred during legalization. Well, how did they change during the COVID pandemic? What do we think? Teens and young adults that use cannabis, did they report using the same amount during the COVID pandemic, using less, or using more? I'm going to take a moment. I do see a good question here pointed out. Did you say we should respect if our kids decide to use? One thing I would note about this is instead of being judgmental or negative or confrontational about a youth's decision to use, there's a way to still be respectful and engage them in conversation to help provide them with information. You may not change their decision to use entirely. You may not be able to say to them, you can't use, you're going to stop using. That may not happen. That's not necessarily the worst thing. If what we can do in framing discussions and having them be honest enough to tell us that they're using, that can lead to discussions about designating a sober driver. That can lead to conversations about setting limits and considering when is appropriate to use. That can lead to conversations and learning moments and teachable moments on how we can encourage youth, if they are using, to think about where they're getting their cannabis from. Are they mixing with other substances? Because we may not be able to force abstinence. If Just Say No had worked, we wouldn't have cannabis as this $8 billion market in Canada. We wouldn't. But we understand that youth may choose to use, and we can't look down on them or treat them as lesser for doing so. But I see everyone's answer to the poll. Most people have said that they would report using more during the COVID pandemic. The answer here is indeed so, is that more youth actually reported using more during the COVID pandemic. And this was especially the case with young people. Early reporting data from 2020, interestingly enough, showed that cannabis consumption didn't really change very much. In fact, they actually said that most teens decreased cannabis use. Now, this is not for the reason that people may think. Some people see this data and they say, oh, well, youth were using less during the pandemic. Well, that's great. Maybe they were finding something to do. Well, the more common reason that youth had for using less cannabis was that they couldn't actually access it. They weren't going out and seeing the people they were smoking cannabis with. They couldn't go and get from the dealers that they were dealing with, as we saw early on in the pandemic. But what we did see was as the pandemic wore on, that pendulum swung the other way. Youth reported a significant change in consumption habits and trended towards an increase in cannabis use. Now, in 2021, youth also reported the greatest increase in frequency of cannabis use. So not only were teens and young adults saying they were using cannabis more often than they used to during the pandemic, but they were using more each time they were using. There's risk to consider there. Increased use can increase the risk of dependency. It can increase the risk of physical harms and physical risks that we'll speak about, psychological and mental harms and risks that we'll speak about a little bit later. But before we get into those, we need to consider, why did youth increase use? If we know there was more youth saying they increased than decreased, what factors came out of this, or what factors played into this? Well, the most common reasons that we saw for youth reporting increased cannabis use during the pandemic included boredom, stress, anxiety, lack of a regular schedule, and you'll notice I have the word relaxation here. The Canadian Cannabis Survey asked youth this question in 2020, 2021, and 2022. They only offered relaxation as an option in 2020. The next 2 years, it was removed from the survey, so it can no longer be collected as a response. But other surveys, including the Canadian Perspective Survey series, as well as reports from CAMH and CMHA, also noted that individuals were at risk for increased cannabis consumption if they were more likely to report loneliness, concern about their financial future, worsening mental health, pre-existing episodic drinking or cannabis use, working in a job that increases the risk of contracting COVID-19, or reporting a lower overall education. So there were a lot of factors that played into here, but what really spoke out and stood out was that the most common reasons that youth had for increasing use had to do with stress, anxiety, and loneliness. They had lost coping mechanisms during the pandemic. They had lost community. They had lost connectivity. They had lost the opportunity to go and do things with other people. And that isolation played a factor significantly to increasing their use of substances, which is why as we're coming out of the pandemic, one of the things we encourage are healthy alternatives for youth, reminding them that there are other things they can do other than substance use. And there are things they can do without needing substance use to enjoy those things. That can include physical activity, spending time with friends, going out and visiting, getting involved in sports and intramurals. And as parents and as providers, we want to make sure that we show an interest in that as well. We take interest in what they're doing to show that we support them in that. Whether that means getting them a ride to a sporting event if they're on a team, whether that means helping them make sure they have a driver if they want to go hang out with friends, whether that means making sure they have access to a safe space at home whereby they can relax and take a load off if need be without feeling like they have to leave. There's a question brought up before the presentation about methods of cannabis consumption. And I like asking this poll question because it's an interesting one. Which of the following methods of cannabis consumption do you think is most common in Canada? Is it smoking dried leaf products, dabbing extracts, which is the use of using a product whereby THC has actually been pulled off of the plant or extracted, the unused material is thrown away, the substance removed is sort of pressurized, and then created into these small kind of sticky substances, crystallized, and then heated up and inhaled. It's called a dab. We have vaping THC e-liquids or consuming edibles. Which do you think is most common? All right. Good split answer here. I see a lot of responses here. I love this one. This is a great question because I always get different responses every time. A slight majority saying smoking dried leaf product is number one, and you would actually be correct. In fact, in 2020 in Ontario, it was estimated for every $10 that was spent on cannabis entirely, $7 of it went to dried leaf product and pre-rolled joints. And if we actually look at sort of the prevalence of use by type or method of consumption, we see smoking is number one, vaping liquid cannabis is number two, and this is really important to understand. Edibles are number three, dried cannabis number four, vaporizing, other methods, dabbing, and drinking. Dried leaf cannabis right now can have a THC potency of up to about 30-ish%. And when I'm talking about potency with THC, we know that THC or tetrahydrocannabinol is that product that causes impairment when we think about changing the way that a person thinks, acts, and feels. It's THC. When we think about a lot of the risks that are associated with cannabis, they tend to be more well known with THC. Dried leaf product, like I said, can contain up to 30%. Cannabis e-liquids or vapes can contain up to 90, 95, 97% THC because these are products whereby the THC has been extracted and then turned into a new product whereby the focus is to make the product as strong as possible. Now, edibles may not be as potent, but they affect the body differently. They take effect much slower, which will mean a person will consume more edibles thinking that they're not getting high. And what we've actually seen, according to reports from sick kids, is that youth that use edibles are more likely to wind up in the ER or in the ICU than any other method of cannabis consumption, usually caused by overconsumption. We also know that the average youth in Canada spends about $65 a month on non-medical cannabis products. That's about 800 and change a year. Great conversation to have with kids is to ask them, what could you do with $800 in a year other than spending it on weed? Good conversation to have with people at a young age. Even if we look at how often different products are used, you'll notice that smoking and vaping are used more commonly on a daily basis. I mentioned that edible number was quite high of how many youth do it, but over half of them do it less than once a month, right? So a lot of youth have tried edibles, but they probably don't do them very often. Those who smoke and those who vape are more likely to do so on more of a regular basis than your eating, your drinking, and your oils. What effect did legalization actually have to the legal ramifications of cannabis? Well, we know that before the Cannabis Act was instilled, one of the issues we saw with cannabis was a youth gets in trouble, they break a law related to cannabis, they get a criminal record, it creates a lot of stigma to their future. Well, now that we have a structured act about cannabis, has this resulted in more criminal charges or less criminal charges? What do you guys think? All right. See, most votes are coming in. I'm going to close this one up here in 3, 2, and 1. Poll's now closing. Looks like about 75% of you say fewer, 25% say more. The answer is this has actually led to fewer charges. Now, prior to legalization, over half of violations of youth-related cannabis offenses resulted in criminal charges. Here we see the last 2 years before legalization, 53% and 51% of violations for youth of cannabis-related laws resulted in them being charged. By 2021, that number had declined to 41%, meaning that the majority of youth who actually violated the Cannabis Act weren't facing charges. Now, why is that? Well, one of the more common things that youth were being charged for was misdemeanor possession, so possession of 5 grams or less. In most provinces, that now responds with a summary fine. Here in Ontario, a youth in possession of 5 grams or less faces a $200 fine instead of a criminal record. Now, multiple offenses may result in community service, diversion programs, education, in some cases, a criminal record, but we don't see that being the first step anymore. Now, this isn't a perfect system. Despite Bill C-93 granting pardons for existing simple possessions of cannabis, now this was something about the Cannabis Act, was that the federal government was pushing for this notion that people with pre-existing possession on their criminal record could actually have that removed. We see over 500,000 Canadians actually still have a criminal record almost 5 years later for cannabis possession. And further to that, this is where we get into sort of the cultural perspectives around substance use. Unfortunately, we see that Indigenous people are arrested at a rate of approximately 9 times higher than other Canadians, despite similar rates of cannabis use. So we do still see, on a structural level, there does still exist a stigma and unfortunately an imbalance in the way that certain cultures are responded to for their use versus others. Which of the following skills can be affected by the presence of THC from cannabis in the brain? Is it work? Is it school? Is it driving? Is it your mood? Is it all of the above? What do y'all think? I sometimes feel like when people see an all of the above to a question, they just kind of like click on that one right away, which is okay. Because in this case, as I'm going to close the poll up here in a moment, since it looks like almost everyone's answered, I'm going to close the poll up. 100% of you said the answer is all of the above. 100% of you would indeed be correct. Now, there are both short and long-term risks to consider to the brain, especially under the age of 25 when it comes to cannabis use. The short-term risks seem simple. They can be loss of coordination, confusion, anxiety, fear and panic attacks. In some significant cases, individuals may actually experience what are called substance-induced psychotic episodes from elevated levels of THC. These are more common among people that use heavy amounts of high-potency products, especially if they're young or new to using cannabis. These can result in symptoms of a psychotic episode, which can actually persist for weeks on end and require hospitalization. We also see risks of impaired memory, concentration, as well as reduced reaction time and depth perception, skills that are very important for things like learning in school, driving a car, playing sports. Now, the long-term risks of cannabis include the knowledge that THC has been attributed to memory loss. The use of THC has been shown to impact the brain's ability to remember things in short term. We also see risks of dependency, more on that later, effects to decision-making and problem solving, significant mental health risks, including correlations, not necessarily meaning causation. There's more research still to be done, but we do see correlations between cannabis and depression. We do see connections between the use of THC and anxiety. And unfortunately, we do see a correlation between higher levels of prevalence of cannabis use associated with increased risk of suicidal thoughts or ideations or tendencies. Finally, we also see psychological risks, including psychosis or schizophrenia, particularly for those who may have a vulnerability or a pre-existing genetic history of these conditions. And again, these risks are elevated for the people who use before the age of 25. Like I said earlier, when I mentioned that it's important to respect a person's decision, respecting doesn't mean you ignore this information. You can still point this out and still be honest about it. But using it as a scare tactic isn't going to work. You have to just be honest about it. This is what the research says. True or false? The majority of Canadians who use cannabis report mixing with alcohol. What do you think? I got 2 more questions after this one. A lot of people say they use cannabis because they don't like alcohol. They say, I don't want to drink. I use cannabis. I don't want to use cannabis. I drink. Different conversations. Now, it looks like just about everyone's responded. Looks like 71% say true, but 29% say false. The answer here is that this is indeed true. In fact, a little over 60% of Canadians report using cannabis and alcohol together, either sometimes, often, or always. And about 1 in 8 teens report that they've mixed cannabis and alcohol together at least once in the past 12 months. Now, alcohol is the substance most often used by all Canadians when we're looking at psychoactive substances. And it's the most common substance mixed with cannabis, second most being tobacco. One thing to note, though, is that over 90% of Canadians who report using cannabis say that they never combine it with other substances, including hallucinogens, sedatives, opioids, stimulants, and prescription medications. This is an important conversation to have with a young person if they use substances, is the importance of them realizing there are risks if they mix them together. Impairment can become very unpredictable if you mix cannabis and alcohol. If you mix benzodiazepines and cannabis, if you mix cocaine and alcohol, there's very unpredictable effects there, things that you may not be anticipating. There's obviously the elevated risks of impaired driving, the increased risk of hospitalization, long-term health risks, and finally the risk of overconsumption or overdose, which may require hospitalization, and in some cases, depending on the substance mixed, could even include fatal overdose. In 2020, more youth in college and university reported driving within 2 hours of consuming alcohol or cannabis. What do we think? I got one question left after this. Then I'm going to pass the floor over to the main event. So, all right, we'll give you guys a few more moments here. Close it up in 3, 2, and 1. Poll is now closing. All right. So it looks like about 72% say cannabis, about 28% say alcohol. So a majority of you are saying that youth are more likely to drive after consuming cannabis. You would statistically be right. In fact, about 17% of cannabis users aged 20 to 24 reported driving within 2 hours of smoking or vaping cannabis, compared to only 8.9% of alcohol consumers saying that they drove within 2 hours of drinking 2 or more drinks. And we know that driving impaired by any substance carries risk. Impaired driving has been illegal in Canada since 1925. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversary. It is also the leading cause of death of Canadians aged 15 to 24. And in 2022, Canadian users cannabis users rather, aged 16 to 19, were 8 times more likely to report being a passenger with a cannabis impaired driver within the past month. So individuals that used cannabis were 8 times more likely to get into a vehicle with a driver who was potentially impaired. This is where that importance of being willing to help comes up. If you have a youth that's using, if you have a youth that's going out somewhere, it's always important and it's always helpful just to ask them, how are you getting there? How are you getting home later? And being willing to help, being willing to be that designated driver or helping them get connected with one. Very last poll question for the evening. You guys have been doing an awesome job on these so far. Question number 10. Which of the following may be a sign that a youth is using substances? Is it spending less time with family and friends, declining performance at school and work, abnormal health issues or sleeping habits, or all of the above? Which I might have accidentally forgot to put into the list. My apologies. Yeah, all right. This is kind of a gimme answer, I think, for some of you that may have noticed the all of the above isn't there, and that's okay. I'll give you a few more moments to fill this one out. The answer is any of these can be a sign that a youth is using substances. And you really have to emphasize this may be a sign of substance use, because we can't assume that it's the case, right? A youth may be spending less time with family and friends because they're depressed. They may just simply be changing their social group. They may be struggling at school because they're using substances, sure, or they may be struggling because they just started a course that they're not very strong in. They may be struggling at work because they've taken on a job that's a little bit too stressful for them. What's important to do is, if you see these sorts of behaviors, instead of jumping to conclusions that this is due to substance use, take it as an opportunity. Take it as a chance to have an open and honest discussion, because your goal is to educate, empower, and support your child. Now, substance use exists on a spectrum. Substance use is not as simple as saying either I don't use or I'm addicted. That's not how substances work. We understand that non-use exists on one side of the spectrum. People choose not to use. The second tier is kind of a controversial one for some people. It's beneficial use. Beneficial use of substances exists because there are prescribed legal substances that can be used, that have been regulated, they've been monitored, they're checked for quality, that have positive health, social, or spiritual effects. Insulin is a substance that people need to survive. You will not be harmed if you are diabetic by using insulin. You need that. There's beneficial use of a substance there. Prescription medications are just that. They're prescribed. They're there with a plan of wellness. Where we see lower risk use is if an individual is using a substance that may have minimal negative impact. Maybe they smoke weed and once in a while they say something that embarrasses them, or maybe they're a little clumsy and they trip and fall a little more often. It's low risk use. Where we see higher risk use is where we see increasingly harmful and negative impacts on a person's life. And finally, where we see disordered or addictive use is a treatable medical condition that involves compulsive use, especially despite the persistence and presence of negative effects. And a person can move back and forth between these stages over time. This is not a one-way street. People can move between these stages over the course of days, weeks, months, or even years. Now, finally, before I pass things along to my ED here, I do want to talk about those risks of substance use, particular with cannabis. We know these can include tolerance, these can include dependence, these can include withdrawal, overconsumption. Certain cancers are attributed with the use of cannabis. Heart disease is attributed to the use of cannabis. We see isolation, spending more time than a person can afford, breaking laws, impulsive decisions. And finally, where we see psychological risks, these include impaired focus, stress, depression, anxiety, psychosis, schizophrenia for those with a medical history, hallucinations, delusions, and mood changes. And to throw one more set of numbers at you, we know that about 1 in 11 people who use cannabis in their lifetime will develop an addiction to using it. That number nearly doubles if the individual began using cannabis during their teenage years. This is why it's recommended that if individuals are thinking of using cannabis, they should wait to do so until the age of 25, because use before that point can have an adverse effect on adolescent brain development. So how do we reduce these risks? We encourage youth to delay the use of substances. And if they choose to use, we can't always stop them from using. So we remind them of the importance of setting limits, of not mixing substances. If they're using cannabis, to look for low THC potency products, avoid vapes, avoid e-liquids, avoid dabs, and look for more natural products. If they're drinking alcohol, they should avoid drinking more than 3 to 4 drinks on a single occasion, and they should definitely avoid mixing with cannabis. They should designate a driver, and as parents, we can help them get that driver. We recommend they avoid the use of cannabis if they're pregnant, have a history of psychological disorders or past substance use disorders, and speak with their doctor if they are using substances. Avoid mixing them together and use in a safe space with people that you trust. Seek medical attention as needed. I keep bringing up this notion of discussions and talking with your youth. I'm going to pass the baton along to my executive director, Chantel. Chantel, I'm looking forward very, very much to your half of the presentation. Now, do you want me to keep showing my screen or do you have the deck up to share?
Let me try to share, and if that doesn't work, then you'll come to my rescue. So just give me 1 second. Maybe you can stop sharing and I'll try to share mine. Okay, let me see. How's this?
Looks beautiful.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so for my part of the presentation, thank you, Steve. Coming after Steve with this avalanche of information and important data, my role is to really be able to encourage you and get you to use this information so it can be relevant in a rich conversation with your kids. Again, what we want to stress out, and Steve talked about it at the beginning, is, I don't know if they're even going to listen to me, right? As a parent, as a caregiver, you may be thinking, what's the use there? I don't really have much influence as far as making those choices about using or not. But as Stephen mentioned, our survey year after year, and it surprises me first, I have to say that I'm the executive director at Drug Free Kids, but I also have 2 teenagers, a 15 and a 17-year-old. So I can relate to, I feel like sometimes that I'm talking to myself. But, year after year, teens are saying that their parents are their preferred source of information, relevant information, that they actually trust that it's a reliable source of information when they're talking about drugs with their parents. If their parents are approaching the subject with curiosity and an openness to it, then they're more likely to trust the information that you will provide to them. And that's followed by school at 56%, and surprisingly, friends at 26%. Because at the end of the day, when we probe a little more as to why that is, they know that, you know, as parents and caregivers, you have their back, and you're coming from a place of love, you're coming from a place of concern, and the information that you're putting on the table that you want to share with them is because you care about them and you want to talk about that, and they trust that information. So information sessions like tonight, when we're providing you with a lot of stats, is an amazing opportunity to say, my God, I just, you know, attended this webinar, I learned this, did you know about this? To be able to share information and show that you care. So keep at it. We're here to encourage you. I'm also going to share with you some resources at the end that we have on our website, and I'll share some of that with you tonight. And I'm also encouraged to see that we have some questions. Don't worry, we will get to them. I was actually excited to see some of the questions that has been asked. I have the studies, the analysis to back up some of the answers that we're going to be providing tonight from psychology professors that are working out of University of Toronto. I also have some answers from a psychiatrist from the University of Western. So I'll be excited to share those answers with you at the end. So also keep posting them as we're presenting. So we'll attend to the questions at the end of the webinar. So how do you go about starting a conversation if you haven't done so, or and you know, continuing the dialogue with your teens? So I'm not here to dictate a specific strategy that's going to work for everybody. We all have different kids around us. We all have a different family context. These are meant to be some suggestions, some paths for you, and that you can explore some more strategies on our website. But when talking to youth about cannabis, this is what we recommend. Stay educated. Know the facts, right? So it's not a matter of just being the moral compass. It's about being able to anchor your concerns in talking about brain development, talking about THC level. You know, the information that's been gathered and shared today with you is a great starting point. And it shows that you care. It's not just a matter, as we said, just say no doesn't work. So how do you back up your concerns into some data? That's a great starting point to be able to start the conversation. Set goals for yourself before starting the conversation. What is it that you're trying to engage with or find out? Are you just trying to find out what they know, generally speaking, about cannabis? That may set a course for the information that you're going to be sharing. Do you want to know if they've already started using? That's another set of conversation. So just being able to know what you're trying to accomplish in the conversation is helpful. Keep an open mind. It's harder. I'm here to say that it's harder than it looks. You know, you can say yourself, but at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is build a foundation and make sure that, you know, there's trust being established, so that if you shut the door right away, if they're confining that they have tried, that you know they have experimented, closing that door right away and not digging further is actually, you know, in a vortex, they'll go and share information somewhere else. So just make sure that you keep an open mind and you have some open questions. Don't lecture, engage. That's obvious, but being able to have open-ended questions, seek what they know, validate what you found out today. Go on a website and validate some of the information is going to help engage in the conversation. But at the end of the day, when I'm saying that, you know, kids look up to us to be able to find some information, some reliable information on substances, it's okay if we don't know it all. And it's okay to be vulnerable and say, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. We don't have to be experts. We're just trying to approach this with curiosity. Find a comfortable setting. Identify where on the continuum of use the kid is at, right? So if the kid hasn't experimented yet, that's one set of data that you can use. But if they're a regular user, that's another tone and matter of a conversation. So try to identify where they are and try to find information that's going to support your position when you're starting a discussion. So I wanted to talk about age-appropriate conversations, because some of you may have teens in the home right now, but also younger siblings. We often get asked, when is a good time to talk about it? Steve talked about it at the beginning of the presentation. Should we wait until 19? I was happy to see that everybody said, no, we shouldn't wait until 19. But people sometimes wonder, well, when do I start and what do I talk about at an earlier stage? So I wanted to provide some examples of what can be shared at what age. And you may be surprised that already I'm starting with toddlers. Well, toddlers at this age, they're just learning about the world around them. They're exploring languages. This is a great time to just set healthy habits and that will remain with them as they grow. You know, they may take a vitamin every day that looks like a character. This may be a time to introduce the fact that this is not candy and it's not something that they have to use as candy. It's a form of medication and it helps them stay healthy. Preschool 3 to 5, they're confident, they're independent, they're fantasy driven. They're more aware of their surroundings. They love fantasies and make believe and tea parties and dress up. They will notice everything that's going on. That's when you're getting asked why 1,000 times and how. Focus on how good it feels to be healthy. What can you do because you're healthy? You know, like I can run fast. So remind your kids that when they feel sick, and what they cannot do. So it's the whole context of what we can do when we're healthy, what we can do to stay healthy, and how we don't feel so great when we're not, when we're sick. Elementary school, 5 to 8 years old. This is a time when kids will go through a lot of changes. They may go from the unconditional parent love and devotion stage from a few months ago to a child who at times can be defiant, resistant to rules. You know, they dislike failures, they love praises, they don't want to lose faces. This is a good time to start talking about tobacco and alcohol and talk about how that can make them sick. For a 5-year-old, there's teachable moments, watching videos and then being able to talk about what we're witnessing. At this age, just talking about the healthy aspect of it and what we can do to remain healthy, that should be enough. Kids vary at different age level of maturity, but usually this introduction of talking about healthy and alcohol and tobacco, that's usually enough. And if they don't ask more questions, then we're good. And if they ask more questions, then as we know as parents, we're winging it. We just go along and answer the questions. And if they're curious, we may go along with the kind of questions that they have. Middle school, 9 to 12-year-old tweens, they're engaging, they're interested, they're also independent, vulnerable, emotional, self-absorbed. They ask questions too. This is a time where they may feel torn between safety and security of the family and the excitement of being with friends. Tone is everything. Again, think about when I was talking about a discussion, not a lecture. You can ask them calmly what they know about drugs and what they're seeing at school, in the community, what are they witnessing. What we recommend to do is really focus on smoking, alcohol, and cannabis, as these are the most often the first substances that they will try. What do they know about it? Where do they get that information? How would they know if that information is reliable? This is a great teachable moment as well to find out, you know, where are they finding the information and, you know, how do they know it's accurate? Communicate that you're concerned about substance use and be honest if you don't know all the information, as I was saying. It's a time where you celebrate good choices with them, you're genuine with your praises, and talk about the importance of health again and the importance of making healthy choices. High school. That's a pivotal age, as we know. It's one of the most exciting and maybe one of the most challenging for parents. The teenagers are developing their own individuality, their ideals, they dream, they may be passionate about a cause and a sport or anything else that interests them. This is also a great time to start talking about, well, hopefully the stage has been set, but talking about alcohol, nicotine, cannabis. These are the most, as we've seen, most widely consumed substances by teens. Vaping, the popularity of vaping is increasing. Spend extra time discussing these substances. What are their opinions about these substances? Why do they feel this way? And it doesn't always have to be, super grave and talking about their own usage. Sometimes it's a matter of looking around. In my neighborhood in Ottawa right now, every second store, there's more right now in the vicinity of where I live, there's more cannabis store than Tim Hortons. That's a great line to start a conversation with a teen. Why do you think that is? What kind of business model do you think that? Do you think that's profitable? Like normalizing that talk so it doesn't become this big grave thing that, at 7 o'clock on a Saturday, we're going to be talking about this. Substances are part of our life. And being able to approach it in that manner may get them to let their guard down and be more open to talk to you about it. It's also the time to, as we were saying, talking about a safe ride, but safety generally speaking. We focus a lot on safe rides because it is super important, but for a teenager who doesn't want to lose face, it's also about making sure that if they decide to use, and we're not there to to be there when they make that decision, get them to think about beforehand. Are they with people they trust? Will there be pictures that are taken without their consent or videos without their consent? Are they sure that they're in the safe space? And introducing and talking about that concept of safety. College and university. Some of you may be in a household where you have older teenagers or young adults. They're independent, and by that time, most likely, if they have decided to experiment, they have experimented already. That doesn't mean that we give up, because as we see, often substances are used for young adults for coping mechanism. So if they're moving to university, if they're moving out of the home as post-secondary, starting a first job, being able to check in on them, ask them about their stress. How is their stress level? How are they coping with it? What kind of coping mechanism if they have into place? How do they release stress? Because at this age, then substances become legal. And just being able to check in on them and seeing what kind of usage they do and how are they coping with stress is a good point to make when having a discussion with your young adults. Active listening. Again, some tips on how to engage in a conversation that is not meant to be confrontational, is not meant to be judgmental. Timing is important. If your kid comes home intoxicated, the emotional charge comes up. You're very concerned. You find something troubling in their pack sack in their room. It's very tempting to confront them right away, or tell them how unhappy we are, how mad we are, or how concerned we are. We advise that it just let the emotions calm down a little bit. The 24-hour rule. There's no point, anyways, talking to somebody who's intoxicated and sharing their concern. That's not going to get you very far. But it's also okay to park it and say, okay, we're going to be talking about this. I want things to calm down, and I'd like us to be able to address this because I'm very concerned. Encouraging a dialogue. Tell them why you're concerned. Use open-ended questions, as I mentioned. What do you know about THC level, for example? Get them talking, get them to engage in a conversation and share their perspective and share the knowledge that they know. Summarize what you heard. That's one of the tips for any kind of active listening. But, like for example, you could say, if I hear you correctly, you feel that, everybody around you is using cannabis and it doesn't seem to have a strong impact on their lives. So you don't feel that there could be some harm associated with that. Did I hear that correctly? And tone again is important, but summarize it. Did I miss something? Or when you're anxious, you feel that drinking before going to the party is actually helping you, and you feel that you can be more social at the party because you're feeling intimidated to go there with this new group of friends. Did I hear that correctly? Just being able to summarize it and be sincere in your approach. Stay positive, show empathy and compassion. At the end of the day, you want to set the stage so that they're going to be able to confide in you and come back to you. Some languages, we just wanted to show you some examples of what could be said. Again, this is not meant to be a strict script and a scenario, but it just to help some of the things that could be shared in a conversation that would be conducive to share more, right? So, for example, I'm just gonna let them, I disapprove of you hanging out with that group of friends. Maybe it's better to say, I'm concerned about your group of friends and worry about you and worry about your safety and your health. Being able to say, you shouldn't be doing drugs. It's bad for you, for example. Instead, I would like to talk about why you smoke cannabis. And I'd like us to be able to, I want to have a better appreciation of in what context you use it or why you think that's okay for you to use. Again, I'm not pretending that this is easy, but it's just some paths for you to explore in having open conversation. Staying on the healthy side, on the risk side, on the harmful side, instead of saying that, smoking weed is bad, saying, I hear that it can be harmful to your brain. And did you know that the brain doesn't fully develop until the age of 25, for example? So those are the kind of things that we encourage. These are very, it's a small portion of what you can find on our website. I invite you to come and find a lot of information. A lot of the information that Steve shared with you is on our website. But it also provides information on other substances, on alcohol, on vaping. It also gives you tips on how to engage in those conversations. We have this guide called the Cannabis Talk Kit, and it provides data and information and facts about cannabis, and then it provides you some scenarios. For example, if your teen tells you it's legal, why would they make something legal that's bad for me? We have some answers. If your teen is saying, well, did you smoke weed when you were a kid? Why was it okay for you to smoke weed and it's not okay for me? We have some examples of some scenarios that can be used for that. So we find it very helpful. It has been distributed across Canada to 500,000 households. So feel free to come on our website and browse. We also have the Parent Support Hub that I'm showing you. So whether you want to help a young person in your life that's already using and you want to prevent problematic substance use, you want to help them address regular substance use, or you just, want some validation as to, I'm concerned about this. Is this normal? Come to our Parent Support Hub. These are professional trained care representatives that are there 24/7 that can answer your questions, your concern, and provide direction to relevant resources. And when necessary, they can also refer you to a mental health professional for short-term counseling support. You can have up to 5 sessions for free, 100% free, with a mental health specialist who can help you or your kid together or separately. It's just a free service that we have, either through a chat line, a chat box on our website, or through a phone line that you can call. So I encourage you, it's free. Feel free to use it if you feel that you need that one-on-one support. So I'll stop now because I want to leave room for questions. And yeah, so I'll pass it over again to Kathleen. I'll stop sharing. Here we go.
Thank you so much. I do apologize. I want to let you know that you might hear some background noise in my end. We did get questions that came in via email in the Q&A. So do you want me to just start asking and we can see where that takes us, or do you, Steve, want to?
Well, there's some that I already know and I didn't see the ones coming in when I was presenting, but I know that there was something about pregnancy, and I know about usage of parents. So I can start answering that, and then Steve may jump in or see if there's other. Is that cool? Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, about pregnancy, it's not illegal. It's not recommended. Definitely, it's discouraged to use while pregnancy. And when I was talking about the fact that we have an advisory board that's made of expert matters across different universities, I was talking to Dr. Stephen Laviolette from Western University. I'm looking at my notes now, and he's a neuroscientist researcher. And they did studies on pregnant women. There was a myth that cannabis, it's not even a myth. Cannabis is the most used substance with pregnant women, with thinking that it's a safe alternative to morning sickness. And what they found was the amount that of THC when being smoked that's transmitted to the placenta is 8 times the concentration that comes to the placenta. So it has a multiplying effect on the baby when weed is smoked. So that's one of the research. I invite you to consult the research if you want. It's at Western University, as I was stating, with Dr. Laviolette, but also you can write to us at Drug Free Kids, and I can provide the research. But it is impacting directly the placenta as a pregnant woman is smoking. So that was one of them. And child use, is child more likely to use marijuana if a parent also uses? I also went through my notes while Steve was presenting, and this comes from the Canada Research Chair in Psychology and Emerging Adulthood, Dr. Abby Goldstein. She's an associate professor at the University of Toronto. And what she found through her studies is when parents use cannabis, teens more likely to have used cannabis in their lifetime in the past month. And what they found was in the studies, if one parent in the home used cannabis, teens were almost twice as likely to use cannabis compared to teens who parents were not using. And when both parents use cannabis, that goes up to teens were 7 times more likely to use cannabis compared to teens with parents that are not using cannabis. So we see that, and they're finding that these findings are likely due to several factors, including maybe the fact that parents may be modeling cannabis use on their teens as a way of coping with either stress or boredom, and that teens have greater access to cannabis since it may be available in the home. So what we often tell parents who are using is to make sure you have safe storage and disposal of cannabis in your house, and that you have those engaged conversation about brain development and healthy coping mechanism. So those are this is what the studies and what the research is showing as far as impact.
And further to your comments about cannabis use during pregnancy, I do remember prior to working for Drug Free Kids Canada, I was a content creator for the Wise Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. And I remember one of the things I researched in the last year that I was working in the program was cannabis use during pregnancy. And the research does actually show there are significant risks to consider when it comes to cannabis use while pregnant. And Chantal, you spoke to the increased sort of concentration at which THC is distributed to the unborn child. We know that THC use during pregnancy can actually increase the risk of things like premature birth, low birth weight, and even stillbirth. We also know that it can delay the development or impair the development of, in particular, the brain in an unformed child. And even when a child is born, if a mother is continuing to use cannabis, the THC can actually pass through breast milk into the infant or the toddler as well. THC use with infants and with toddlers, the more common things that we see it being risks for in those situations are things like emotional regulation and learning verbal speech and languages. So youth that have been exposed to THC actually report more of a delay of being able to sort of emotionally take it, like regulate their feelings or be able to express themselves verbally. So those are a couple of the things that I remember came up in the research when it came to pregnancy. Another one of the questions that I saw was right here. Does your organization offer any one-to-one information sessions to provide info to a teen with their parents? And I think, Chantal, you spoke to this already. I think the best resource I would suggest to that would probably be the Parent Hub. That it's there to offer support for support, right? Like we're there, that the purpose of that hub is if you are struggling, if you are trying to figure out how can I engage, how can I have these conversations, you can reach out to that hub. It does offer support to help out parents with having those discussions.
And
Um,
sometimes so yes, 100%, I would strongly, and there's no harm done. Try the Parent Support Hub. If it doesn't suit you, it's free. But these people are trained to be able to support you in that process. But also, I find that we found that teens are more susceptible to look at facts and data on their own. So maybe it's even a matter of going on our website and printing some pages off our website as to why you're concerned, right? So I understand, and I feel for you when you're saying they're resistant to any conversation, and I keep on saying engage and get them on a dialogue, and you feel like at the end of the day you're the only one talking. You can just print some material and leave it there for them to consult and say, I'd love us to be able to talk about this later, right? And tell me what you thought of it. So you actually depersonalize the conversation. It's not you talking and sharing perspective from each other, but you're commenting on a paper that you're putting in front of them and getting their feedback on it if this is what they're witnessing as well. That could be an option as well.
and I also, when I hear that idea that a teen or a child is resistant to the conversation about substance use, one thing I like to remind parents is that substance use isn't just about substance use. It's about mental health. It's about wellness. It's about where the individual is at, and it's about their coping. It's about their interests. It's about their passions. If a youth is using cannabis, one reason we know that's commonly used is coping. It's dealing with stress. It's dealing with anxiety. It's enjoyment. It's making them feel good. So one of the things I often speak about with youth is coping mechanisms in and of itself. I'll ask young people, what do you do when you have a bad day? What cheers you up? And when they start telling you about their interests and their passions, you can sort of have those inroads in conversations about asking about the other things that bring them joy and getting them to expand on those, to explore those, to recall those. I remember in conversations I had with a substance abuse program that I used to work with, was that when they had youth and clients that were coming off of using cannabis, and this is specifically with cannabis, I asked them, what were you finding the youth were doing that were the most successful at stopping use or actually significantly reducing use? And the most common thing they kept pointing to was the fact they started doing other hobbies. They pointed out the fact that many of the youth mentioned that they began getting physically active. It might have been exercise or sports, but it might have just been as easy as going for a walk. If they had a pet, walking the dog every day or every couple days. It was getting a little bit more of that social aspect, reminding them to spend time with their friends instead of just texting with their friends. It was, for some of them, it was the low energy, getting them to watch some TV, watch some, things they enjoy watching. But another one that kind of caught me off guard, because it's something I personally never would have thought of, was journaling. A lot of youth that were reducing substance use or stopping substance use were mentioning that journaling was helping them because they were able to externalize thoughts and see them sort of as an outside person looking in, but they didn't have to tell someone else what that was exactly. It was private to them. They could still, kind of externalize those thoughts. But those were some coping mechanisms that they found were effective with youth that were trying to reduce substance use in general. There was
There's
also a
one
few
more
questions
question.
here. There was a couple that popped up before the presentation, and I touched on a few of these during the presentation, but I'll try to come back to them real quick. The first was if teens going to use cannabis despite being told not to, despite it being aware of all the negative consequences, what types of cannabis are the least harmful? Not straight CBD. We don't condone THC use and want to be educated about harm reduction. So one of the questions was wondering about the difference between sativa, indica, and hybrid. If you speak with many producers, a lot of them are starting to notice more and more that sativa was traditionally known as cannabis products that were a little higher in THC. Indica products tended to be known as being a little bit higher in CBD, and hybrids sort of had a balance of both. More and more producers are finding that these titles are really just fancy labels to put on their cannabis products. They don't carry the same sort of connotations that they used to. What really becomes important to understand is what that level is of the potency of the product that's being consumed. And even with hybrid products, there's long been a harm reduction messaging of buying balanced products. If a person's going to use elevated THC, they should also elevate CBD. Well, I remember a report that Health Canada was looking into back in 2021 that was actually noting that CBD, high CBD products were actually being returned and claimed at stores as individuals were actually having issues with hallucinations, delusions, and things caused by elevated THC levels. And it wasn't because they were using high CBD only. That's not what I'm saying. But what it was is they were buying a product that was very potent with THC and thinking if they just got an elevated level of CBD, it would balance it out. More and more, the research is showing that the higher the THC level is, the less impact CBD actually has on antagonizing that process. So balanced products are still great, but it's more important to remind them to lower the THC consumption. So I alluded to this during the presentation, but your higher potent products are things like dabs and extracts and e-liquids. So your vapes, your dabs, your keef, your hash, your shatter, these products that are known for being 60%, 70%, 80% THC. Your lower potency products tend to be your dried leaf product because right now the plant itself only maxes out at about a 30% potency. Use of THC and CBD, I kind of got to that already. Methods of consumption, we do know that each method can have its own sort of individual risks. I mentioned that edibles can take effect slower. So sometimes a youth might have a couple, think they're not working. And I always joke with them, I'm like, well, does that mean you quit? And they're like, well, no, that means I'm going to have more because they want to feel something. Well, then all of a sudden they have 5 or 6 and they feel something, but they're really only feeling the first edible that started digesting 2 hours after they started eating it. They're still not feeling the second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth yet. And because we know that edible cannabis can last, the effects can last for up to, and sometimes even longer than 24 hours, this can be a very harrowing experience for someone that's not used to it. Someone who's maybe a novice, someone that's not expecting a product to be quite so strong. And finally, the amount of THC that can evoke certain feelings, this can really depend on a person's tolerance. You could have someone use a product that's 10% THC and be unable to find their own feet. You could have someone else use a product that's 55% THC and all they're going to do is sit and watch some TV and maybe eat some potato chips. Tolerance plays a big factor here. Their genetic makeup plays a factor here. The person's size, their age, their previous experience, whether they're mixing with other substances. I know I'm listing off these factors very quickly, but it's to try to answer that question to note that the potency matters, but it doesn't mean that having low potency is no risk. So I tried to kind of rapid fire that one long question.
It's pretty
Is there anything you want to
impressive.
add to that one, Chantel, while we're on it?
No, I think you did a great job, Steve.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you guys
Yeah, is
so
there
much.
any others?
I think that might be it. I'm just going to wait maybe another minute just in case any last. You guys are incredible. I was so engaged the whole time.
Oh,
And
thank you.
As a parent of a teen and 2 preteens, I feel equipped but scared at the same time. So
And it's
appreciate
normal,
it.
right? It's 100% normal, and they'll feel nervous too, you know. And it's okay. It's okay to approach your teen and say, okay, I know this is not maybe the most comfortable subject to talk about, but guess what? I'm nervous too, but I think it's so important. And just showing that, you know, you're feeling those emotions too, but it is important to talk about it, shows how, you know, important it is to take the time to talk about it and how concerning, like, you rooting all this in the love that you have for them. And I know it sounds cheesy, but it's true. And as a parent and as a caregiver, that's your role, right? And it's okay. It's your role. Like, you know, who are you, my mom? Who are you, my caregiver? Yes, I am. And that's why we're going to be talking about this, because I care. So I strongly encourage parents to not feel discouraged and think, oh, what good is it going to do? I tried, it didn't work. Keep at it. Keep at it. It gets there. You may not think that it gets through, but and you're planting seeds at the end of the day so that when they're faced with making that decision and you're not there, hopefully these will be and then it will be taken in consideration. And if they still try and if they still want to use, they'll ask the right question. They'll know about THC. Where is this coming from? Like, being able to ask the right questions, knowing that, do I have a safe ride home? Do I feel safe here? Will these people have my back? Like, these are all seeds that you're planting so that when they're making a decision, they're making an informed decision and they're making, you know, the safest decision at the end of the day. So hopefully we gave you enough tools to be able to put them into practice and encourage you to just, and if you need encouragement, come to see us on our website, go on our support hub. We're there to help.
I really appreciate it. I do see one other question sneak in. Do you think we have time to answer that before we wrap up?
I think so. Is there a resource that you found teenagers accepted and read? I mean, it's really easy for me to point to the resources at DFK. We do have great resources. There is actually, Chantel and I were just meeting with an agency yesterday that they actually created a self-guided module that youth can do. It's totally free. It takes about 90 minutes. It's all about cannabis and mental health. And one of the selling points for youth about it is they get like a LinkedIn badge and they can put it on their resume. They actually completed it. And the aesthetic of it is nice to look at too. I like it because a lot of the research when they were putting it together, they did correspondence with the program I was working in at the time. So I'm always happy to point it out. It's from the Schizophrenia Society of Canada. I can post the link in here. It's actually really easy to find. It's just called Cannabis and Mental Health.ca. I just sent it directly to Chantel because I'm smart like that.
Thank you.
But that is one external. Like I said, I can certainly say, and like I just started working directly over for DFK at the beginning of last month. I like what we have on our site. We have great resources, we have great materials, but it's easy for anyone working in a program to say, I love our program. And I do, I really do. But if you're looking for one that's external as well, that's another one that I do.
Of course. At the end of the day, we're all trying to do the same thing and we're all complementary to each other, right? But one of the things that at Drug Free Kids, at least what we're trying to do is, how do I put this in a conversation so it makes sense? How do I approach my 13-year-old with this information? So, but that the importance of talking about where to find reliable information, that applies to anything. They're going to write papers. They're going to have to, they're going to have to develop their critical thinking. That's a great learning thing about where do you find your information on cannabis. And there's a lot of resources outside of us that are all complementary to what we're trying to do.
That's amazing. Well, I very much appreciate it. And what I'm going to do is for everyone who has registered for this webinar, they will get a copy of this recording. And I'll also put both the links to DFK and the cannabismentalhealth.ca for anyone who might want to do a bit more research. I just want to thank you both so much. I have learned so much, and I can see from the chat, so many families and parents and caregivers appreciate what you guys do, and how enthusiastic you were is very engaging. So I appreciate you both for taking your evening and chatting with us. For those of you who are watching, whether it's live with us now or on replay, if you do have more questions or you are looking for support, please reach out to us at Adopt for Life, and we will make sure that we are giving you the appropriate resources needed. And the contact, thankfully, I have both of their emails now, so they can't get away from us. So I'll be happy to connect you with the right people as well. So I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a great evening for the rest of your night.
Thank you. Thank you very much.